Okay. Seeing that?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay. So, status update on our adventures with ISO 20022. So, I'm going to be talking about where we are now, about ISO 20022 for inclusive instant payment systems, about messages and APIs, market practice document, and potentially an African ISO 20022 initiative. Okay, so where are we? We've been a member of the ISO 20022 organization since 2022. We're represented on the Registration Management Group, which is the top-level committee, Payments Standards Evaluation Group, Technical Support Group, and the API Support Group. I'm going to skip over this because I've got a lot of slides and we've talked about this, I think, already. So, what do we think was missing from ISO 20022 messages? Well, broadly, and especially an agreement of terms phase. The original ISO 20022 messages did not have deterministic outcomes for payments. They didn't have non-repudiation messages. So we have added to the payment, execution, and status messages cryptographic locks, which we've added to payment execution and the FI to FI payment message that we use for currency conversion. And the cryptographic keys we've added to the acknowledgement message, the status message relating to a payment. That's been done. That's in the standard as it now exists. We have added expiry times also to the PAX 008 and PAX 009 messages, and they are in the standard and have been included in the published data dictionary. We're currently working on the definition of new messages to cover the agreement of terms phase. The ISO 20022 evaluation team suggested that we should use new messages rather than varieties of an existing message. So we produced a business justification, which has been approved. We've extended the ISO 20022 data model, at least proposed its extension to include the new messages. And we have revised and resubmitted the message definition report for the proposed messages following an initial review. That's currently going through the review phase. I was lucky enough to receive this morning the latest set of comments to which I need to respond, but in principle, it's in this year's maintenance cycle. We are also, should say, including costs in the currency conversion message. They didn't have it in the first place because it was expected that those kinds of transfers would always be governed by the correspondent agreements we were talking about earlier today, and therefore wouldn't need the definition of individual costs. We are, of course, do need additional costs so that FXPs can communicate the costs to their customers. So we have made a request to add costs to the to the PAX 009 message. So currency conversion. ISO 20022 doesn't contain support for retail currency conversion. The FX support that ISO 20022 has essentially for settling large-scale currency trades. It's not the retail level thing that we need. So we treat it as a request for payment cover, which is done by a PAX 009. This includes a link to the main payment to ensure that PVP, payment versus payment, is maintained and that people don't execute currency conversions if the associated payment does not succeed. So what we have now is an API mapping of ISO 20022 messages as follows. On the payer side and the payee side, and the foreign exchange provider side, discovery is sorry, these are the three phases: discovery, agreement, and transfers. And our message is, or sorry, our messages are, sorry, discovery, the original discovery message is sent out as a get parties. It doesn't have a payload, so we don't need to worry about it. The response is an account management 024 message. This is a standard message. It's also used by the Nexus project, a BIS project for inter-scheme payments. So it's a generally used message in that space. For agreement, for FX, we are using a new message, which we're currently calling pax.091. And the response to that will be a pax.092 from a foreign exchange provider. Standard agreement of terms between DFSPs. It's a post quotes, and the message we're planning to use for that is a variety of the PAX 008 message, which again we're calling PAX 081. The response to that will, you'll be amazed to hear, be a PAX.082. We post FX transfers. We request the execution of FX transfers using a PAX 009. And the response to that is a PAX 002. That's the standard payment status message. For inter-DFSP transfers, the actual payment transfers, the message is PAX 008, and the response is a PAX 002 again. And where we require a patch for transfers, that too is a PAX 002. It's a status update. We allow status updates, for instance, to the beneficiary institution, the payee DFSP, if it requests it for special purposes. So you can see that all of the phases in the current Moduloop API have, well, except the get parties, which doesn't have a payload, have an associated ISO 20022 payload defined for them. So we are where we think we needed to be in relation to the actual content of our messages. So now let me look at the question of messages and APIs. Now, as you know, most, or maybe you don't know, but I'll tell you anyway. Most ISO messages are represented in the form of XML schemas. They are produced in XML, the messages themselves are XML. But that is an implementation of an underlying data dictionary definition, and there's a standard converter that takes an underlying data dictionary definition and produces an ISO 20022 schema based on it. Now, the ISO 20022 Technical Support Group has now published a white paper which shows how to generate JSON schemas from the underlying data dictionary. So we can now see how to generate a JSON schema, which is the equivalent of the XML schema. This is an advance. Up to now, we've been working with what are essentially semi-automated conversions of our own to produce the JSON versions of the existing XML messages. So an API then adds a verbal structure to the message. That is an HTTP command, the name of the resource which the command should act on. And each schema now represents the information which is sent or received via the verbal structure of the API. So again, each endpoint has what, something which has the structure of an ISO 20022 message associated with it. So it's attached to a command plus resource combination, as you saw before. It's get.parties or post.transfers, whatever it might be, a command plus resource combination. So it's possible for the same message structure to have a different semantic meaning, depending on the endpoint it's attached to. And the TSG Technical Support Group has also published a white paper on best practices for ISO 20022 API definitions. That's just been published. We will be reviewing it to make sure that our API meets the requirements of that definition, or at least if it doesn't, then we can get back to them and say we think they're wrong if we do. We're also in the API technical group working towards a unified message definition format so that members can submit proposals either for messages or for API content in the same context. And it's clear that the content is the same whether it's used in a message or in an API body definition. Now, let me talk about header information. So HTTP header fields contain information about the message. Essentially, they are, Miller, I will just say, I think the white paper is a link in the presentation. If it isn't, I will make it into a link, and when I post the paper in the directory, everyone will be able to see it and get it. So HTTP fields contain information about the message. In our world, they fall as two types: either standard fields defined by the W3 consortium, or module loop specific fields. ISO 20022 has a definition for what they call a business application header. And the purpose of this is to provide a consistent and standard way for information about a message to be conveyed with the message, independently of the transport network used. Now, the SWIFT standard for cross-border messages, for instance, you already uses a business application header. So it's something which is, I think, starting to command more acceptance than was originally the case. And there's also a standard container for that, a business message envelope, which essentially is a holding structure which contains a business application header plus a message of any supported type. That's an example. You're probably not very interested in that, but I thought I would include it just to give people an idea. So now, if we look at the module specific header fields, they are the DFSP who originally sent the message, the DFSP to whom the message is ultimately addressed, the encrypted fields of an API message, if encryption is used, the signature of the message, computed by its originator, the URI of the message, and the HTTP method used when the message was sent. Now, our proposal is that messages exchanged via an API should make use of a business application header. We think that this should be able to contain all the module loop specific fields currently defined for the HTTP header in the FSP IOP specification definition. General header fields, on the other hand, should remain in the HTTP header. Now, this is, I think, a question that we've talked about it in the ISO 20022 special interest group, but it's a question that we need to think a little bit about, and possibly quite a lot about, because the business application header, I think, is not yet currently used in a number of implementations that we know about of ISO 20022 in instant payment systems. Now, I think that it offers considerable advantages, and in particular, it offers advantages in that it provides a way in which information can be transport information can be included in XML-based messages, which is still valid for JSON-based messages, leaving aside the question of non-repudiation signatures. But the information, it should be possible for someone who is generating let's say a CBPR plus message in Swift, a cross-border message in Swift, could include business application header information that could then be used in a module loop specific context. So we will try to argue the case for inclusion of the business application header as part of the IIPS definition of an ISO 20022 interface. Now, market practice document. The market practice document explains how a given scheme implements ISO 20022 messages. Now, ISO 20022 messages are very large. They have lots of different alternatives, most of which are not used by most schemes. So the market practice document essentially says which optional fields should not be used, which optional fields are mandatory for that scheme, and which, no, sorry, that's basically it. That's what it says. And it explains, it explains the usage of the various fields in the message and their semantic meaning for that scheme. They're registered with the ISO 20022 organization, but they don't require ISO 20022 approval. And we expect to produce a modular market practice document which can be specialized by individual schemes to suit their own implementations. We have an initial release which was produced for the COMESA implementation, and this is being reviewed at present and generalized to provide a general modular version. Now that is in its own repository. There's a link to it in there, so once I upload this stuff, you will be able to go and look at it. The sequence diagrams appear separately, both as source and as SVG diagrams. They can be edited in place. The message content descriptions can be edited in place. Each endpoint has its own markdown text file, which can be used to describe the activity of that endpoint. And the overall document is created from a script which combines all of those elements into a single thing. This is a considerable amount of work that's been undertaken by Paul Baker and the Infotex team. And shout out to them for doing a great and comprehensive job that enables us to work with individual parts of a repository and to produce overall scripts as a consequence of that. And reviews can be undertaken as pull requests, as we're doing at the moment. So you can look at things individually on your own machine and submit them for review. So that is where we are on the market practice document. Finally, I want to talk a bit about the wider context of ISO 20022. Now, as you know, ISO 20022 standards are becoming more common in payment systems in Africa. And eventually, payment systems which use these standards will start to connect with each other. The earlier we do something about this, the simpler and cheaper connections between systems will be. What we could do now to help us meet our objective is, what's our objective? A payment instruction issued by an FI in any jurisdiction should be comprehensible to a processing FI in any other jurisdiction, subject obviously to a way of settling between those jurisdictions, an agreement on regulations and an agreement on compliance. Now, how we would get to a position like that is not a question we can answer straight away. We know that there are substantial differences between the ways in which individual jurisdictions and individual schemes have implemented ISO 20022. So we want to start as soon as possible trying to figure out what those differences are and what we should do about them. Africa and India have agreed to sponsor this initiative. However, there are semantic mismatches between payment systems, semantic mismatches between messages. When I say semantic mismatches between payment systems, I mean, for instance, the question of the existence of an agreement of terms phase. Different schemes use different messages for the same purpose. There are different forms of message specialization. Some schemes require certain fields which other schemes don't allow. And there are differences in market practices. We can avoid these by discussions at the model level, openness to alternatives, and attempts as far as possible to use the standard as a standard and not to extend it, for instance, by adding additional pieces of information which don't immediately belong to the standard. Next step is to establish a forum. We've tried several times with African Ender to get going on this, so far without success. But that's, I think, not for lack of goodwill. It's just a question of getting together and establishing something. And we're also working on an additional review with Rwanda to see if and how our proposed modular ISO 20022 structures can be mapped onto the existing R-switch ISO 20022 definitions. We would like to get involved with IPSL in Kenya as well and ask the same set of questions. So we will be trying to do that in the near future. And that is all I have for you. Does anyone have any questions on any of that? Miller has asked if I will post a link to the ISO white papers, and I have promised that I will in the uploaded copy of the presentation.